Hey everyone, this is just a quick tutorial on how to create a 3D reflection inside of Nuke. So this is not the 2D trick method that we can use to kind of create some fake reflections. These are actually ray trace reflections inside of Nuke. So if you could just take a moment and hit the like button and subscribe, as it really helps with the YouTube algorithm and supporting the channel and trying to get this started here. The channel is pretty new. I don't have that many followers or anything like that yet, but I hope to produce a lot more content like this. So if you guys could just take a second and just do that, that would be really big help for me. So this is the effect we're going to be creating. We have a sphere here that's chrome, and this is completely fake, and it's inside of Nuke. We're not going in Maya or Blender or anything like that, and this effect is achieved entirely in the ray render node inside of Nuke. So how do we do this? Actually, the setup is not that complicated. And I can actually provide you guys the project file if you want to have some assets to play with. So I've provided you guys with this footage here, just a little kind of AstroTurf area with a bench, and then we have a sky picture, and then we also have a 360 picture and just a picture of the opposite angle. So I'm going to teach you guys two ways to actually create this reflection. There's a cheap way and there's kind of the right way. And the reason I like teaching both ways is because sometimes you're in a pinch and sometimes you don't have all the rendered assets that you need, or you might not have like a 360 picture like this. So what I'm teaching you how to do is, even if you don't have a 360 camera, or you are receiving this footage from somebody else, you'll still be able to create a reflection for those shots using these techniques. Using the kind of hacking compositing way. And as a compositor, you want to always be thinking how to get the result no matter what you have, and being resourceful. So that's really important. So without dragging that on too long, let's get to actually how to create this effect. So what we're going to do, first you need a 3D camera track. So I've provided you guys with that in the script file, so you guys don't need a 3D camera track. This tutorial is not about 3D camera tracking. If you need to find that, I have other information on that. So if we just start with our shot here, I'll just go over here, so the track is here. I've basically tracked this scene, and I've placed a card on the ground plane of this scene. So again, if you don't know 3D tracking, I do have other tutorials out there for that. But if we just look through our camera, let's just merge this over so we can see. And let's put it as a wireframe. So I'm going to put a wireframe shader just to show you guys that there is in fact a 3D track scene here. So this is just the wireframe texture it just creates this kind of, you can see the polygons of your geometry, and I'm just putting that onto the card that I've placed on the ground plane. So that's what we're going to start with. We have a ground and a 3D tracked scene with a camera. So what we actually need to do to make a convincing reflection is we actually need to project this footage onto the ground around the object that we're reflecting. So if we look at our footage here, we see that this sphere is actually reflecting the grass that it's sitting on and everything around. So all we need to do is we put that ground plane into 3D space, and we're going to reproject this plate that we're filming with. So this video that we're looking through, we're going to project that onto the geometry. So that's the first step. So we're going to create that card, and that's been given, so you guys start with the card. Next thing we need to do is we create a sphere. So I put a sphere here and just put it into 3D space in the right spot. So just a basic sphere, and if I hit play here, you'll see once it caches that this video is kind of playing through, and it's kind of the caching is not that great in Nuke when you're playing it for the first time, but you can see the video is rotating around and projecting that image onto the card. So we're just using the video, a normal project 3D node. We've hooked in our camera, and then we plug that texture into a card. So now it's shooting that video out from our camera onto the card. And the next thing we're going to do is we want to put a reflection node on the sphere. And the other thing we need to do is a normal scanline render won't work for this. So we're going to delete the scanline render. And I'm going to create a node called ray render. You guys might be familiar with this node already. But this tutorial is still going to be useful for you because it's going to teach you how to mix projections and still get a reflection. So if you guys already know how to use this, it's still a useful tutorial, I think. So we're going to plug in a ray render node, and we're going to look through that result. And what we can see already is if we actually see that this is already kind of working, this effect is sort of already working. We have a sphere that is reflecting the ground around it. So we can see that if we just disable the reflection and enable, it's actually ray tracing this reflection. So the difference between the scanline and the ray trace. The scanline render is good for like elements and smoke effects and some lights and stuff like that. But if you're going to create a reflection or some actually physically accurate shadows, you need to use the ray render node. So okay, so we're already most of the way there, but we want to make this a lot better. And something that's important about reflections is that they need to be spatially accurate. So if you were looking at this ball, you would think that, well, maybe it would be reflecting more of this bench. And this bench is right next to the ball, so we should be seeing some of that actually in this reflection. But the problem is we're projecting this entire image onto a flat plane. So it can't accurately, this ball can't accurately reflect what's sitting next to it, which is this bench. So what we need to do is we need to start building a simple model build of the geometry that sits around this sphere. And we can do that just inside of Nuke. So we're going to just expand this a little bit. And I'm going to create a cube node and just plug that in. And I'm going to scale it down because it's huge. Our scene's kind of tiny, so I'm going to scale it down. And I'm going to set the divisions to 1 and 1 because I don't need the cube to have a bunch of subdivisions. It just makes it harder to grab inside of Nuke sometimes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug the same project 3D node that's giving our card a texture. I'm going to plug that straight into the cube as well. So now that image is being projected onto the card and onto the cube. So if I move the cube around, you see that the texture is changing. And that's because we're not applying the texture as a texture to the cube. We're applying it as a projection. So that, just imagine that video is starting in the camera and being projected out, and it's wrapping around our geometry. So our goal with this is we need to kind of line it up with where it is in the real world. So the easiest way to do that is to look at the projection and line it up to the ground plane. So if you look at where this thing starts on this flat plane, it's right here on this card. So all we need to do is take the cube and put the front of the cube on the front of the real box here. So I'm going to line it up and just slide it over until you start to see that the box lines up. So something like this, and just going to keep moving it, and you see there's still a little bit of an edge here on the ground. You see how that edge doesn't line up with the cube, so we know we just need to rotate our cube just a little bit. So I'm going to take the cube and just rotate it in the Y. So I'm just slightly rotating it. So if you look at this edge as well, you see this is the if we look at the footage, this kind of curved wire is the edge of that cube. So in our 3D, we're just gonna take it and rotate it so that that edge lines up with our fake edge. So I'm gonna rotate it like that and just line it up here. And one thing we can do to also make this a little bit better is I have a lens distortion node provided to you guys as well, and we're gonna undistort our footage that's coming in. So that's just gonna help a little bit and there's very little distortion on this, so it's not gonna make a big impact, but that is something that is kind of necessary depending on the camera you're filming with. So this was filmed on an iPhone, there's very little distortion. So next thing we're gonna do is sorry, my wacom messed up there a little bit. Okay, so we got that cube lined up, and we're just going to shrink it in the Z a little bit. So I'm holding Command and Shift on a Mac to make sure that we have these scale selectors there. I think it's that would be Control Shift on Windows, but I'm just scaling that into place and making sure at the bottom of our projection that it's lined up. And it doesn't matter if the cube is sticking to the ground a little bit. You're not going to see that anyways. And then I'm going to scale it up until it starts to hit the edge of the wood. So now if we rotate it around, you see it actually lines up with the real world. So now if we scrub through, we see that kind of sticking. That image is sort of sticking. It's not 110%, you know, it's not a perfect lineup, but for the sake of this tutorial, it's gonna do good enough for our reflection. So I'm going to copy the cube, and I'm going to do the same exact thing for the other side. So I'm just going to copy it, plug it into our scene, and plug it into our Project 3D, and just slide this over until we hit our other little side of our bench here. And that's what we're going to get. We got something like this. And lastly, we're going to duplicate that cube, plug it into our projection again, and we're going to move it up this time and scale it down in the Y, and then scale it in our X, and then just shift it over. So what we're doing is we're creating the top part of the bench. And yeah, Nuke's transform tool is still not the best. They really need to fix it, but you know, they do not think it's a priority. But yeah, so this is sort of close here. So you can see we're starting to basically rebuild our real world in CG. All right, this is pretty good. So this is going to give something to our sphere to reflect. So we're basically building the CG world out just so that we can get a reflection of those objects in the proper way. And since this is closer, it's going to reflect differently than something that's very far. So if we just take a look at our ray render again, and we go back out into the 2D, I'm going to close all this. Now we can see, we start to see some of our pieces actually wrapping and being close. So if, for example, I take the sphere and I move it, we're going to see as it gets closer to that object, it's actually reflecting it. So if I put it really, really close, you see it's actually, you know, you could even put it inside of it like that, and it's reflecting the edges, which is a pretty cool effect. So you can do all kinds of stuff with this. You could create, you know, even a basic window, you can use the same technique, and I'll show you guys that briefly after. Actually, I'll just show you right now. It's very simple. So the same technique, you could take, you know, a plane, or sorry, a card, and plug it in. Let's close everything just so we can see what we're doing. So this is the same principle of what we're doing, but a very, very simplified version. Is just a reflection, a card, and then just taking another card. I'm going to take I'm going to take this 360 picture and put it on a sphere instead. So let's take a sphere and we'll plug this picture into it, and we'll plug that into a ray render just quickly. You guys don't have to follow along with this one. It's just to demonstrate the principle. And let's create a scene node and scale up that sphere so it's big. And if we reduce the size of our card, we're going to see what's happening here. So this is kind of hard to see, so I'm just going to reduce the size. So here's our little reflective card, and here's our camera. So that is automatically going to reflect whatever is opposite of it. So if we're looking at this, it's hard to see a little bit, but this card here is reflecting the sphere around it. So you understand, if you have a 3D camera track and you have a window, you could just stick a reflective card on that window and then put another image opposite of it. So you could, it doesn't matter what image you use. So if you don't have, for example, this 360 photo of the place that you filmed, it doesn't matter. You can still do this and just take a different photo that looks like it would be something that would be behind the glass that you're filming. So that's essentially the principle. But we're doing a more advanced version, which is actually building it out into the actual spatial scene that it is. So we can continue to build this. I'm not going to build out the whole thing. I'm going to switch over here to what I've already done. So this is what I built out, and I just put this little barrier here, the wall. You could even put the plant. You see the plant is not built out here, this little pot for the plant. You could put a cylinder and you build it out if you want. So that works for the foreground stuff. It works for all the stuff around, directly around, and that's going to give you a pretty good reflection as it is. But the next thing we need to do is we need to give it something to reflect in the sky. So if we look at this, what we have just done, and we just look at the result, we see that we have like a black sky. There's nothing to reflect. And so what we need to do is just any picture of a sky. I just took a 2D picture and kind of graded it up and put it on a sphere. So if I zoom out and look at that sphere, this is all it is, just straight onto the sphere, and I transformed it to kind of scale it. So that's all we got. And now if we look at the ray render, we can see that we filled in that black with the sky. So this is the kind of like quote-unquote cheap version, and this will get you, if you don't have the 360 picture or anything like that, this is still going to work for you, and you can still get a reflection. But I also did take this 360 picture, so this is just better because this is actually going to give us, you know, everything else that was actually beyond, you know. So we have our close objects that we modeled. So we have this like bench, and we have this little wall here and everything, but we have these really objects that are further away, like the sky and the house and the chairs. I don't want to model all those things because they're so far away from the camera. But if you do have a 360 picture, you can use that instead. So I'm going to switch it over to that because that's going to give us a better result. So if I just take a look at that result, you can see that's a much better result. And if you want to learn how to take 360 pictures, you can do it with any camera. You know, you can take an iPhone, you can take an Android phone, and there's a lot of apps even to take 360 pictures. And any of those are going to work for getting a reflection map. And you can plug that straight into your sphere. Okay, so this is working pretty well. You notice that all these weird things are happening in the background, and that's just because we're kind of looking at the picture that we placed behind. So what we want to do is we don't want to be, our final image, we don't want to kind of output through this ray render. We just want to get the ball. We just want to get the ball out of the ray render. So what we need to do is just off to the side, create a scanline render. I'll just do it separately. I'm going to create a scanline render, plug it into the same camera, and then I'm going to plug the object into the same sphere that we're wanting to keep. And this scanline render is just going to give us an alpha of that ball, and we can use that to mask it out from this ray render result, because we don't want all this weird stuff, and we don't want to reproject our whole environment. We just want to, because that's going to actually distort and blur our image a little bit, and we want to have control. So what we do is we just mask that out, and then we have just our reflective wall. And this allows us to just A over B, merge it over our image. So here's our background, and here's our ray rendered result that we stenciled out or masked out, and that's what we got. We have a reflective sphere. And lastly, what we can also do is another technique. So what we want to do also to make it a little bit more convincing, we want to add what's called ambient occlusion. And we can do this inside of Nuke as well with the ray render. So if we just take a look at what that is, it takes a second to process there. So what this is doing is it's creating a contact shadow between the two pieces of geometry inside of Nuke. So that makes it a lot more convincing. You see it before and then after. It really feels like more of an object is there. So how do we create an ambient occlusion? This is very simple. So we can just take the same setup we did. We take our reflective sphere, the same geometry we used, and just copy it. And we copy our ground plane. So we just take those two pieces of geometry and we plugged it into an ambient occlusion node. So you can just type it in, ambient occlusion, and make sure you have it plugged into, you know, like a constant or something like that. And we can just take a look at the result. after we look at the render. It takes a little bit of a time to process that. And again, so you need to use the ray render node for this as well, not the scanline render. If you plug in a scanline render, this is not going to work. So the ray render is good for reflections and good for this ambient occlusion pass. So this is a pretty good result. And the last thing we need to do is, if I just go back to frame, I'm going to go back to the start frame here, frame 55, just to show you guys a problem that you might see. So we see that our geometry, so at the start frame here, we see that our geometry is kind of ending here, like the card is not long enough. So we're seeing the edge of the card. So either you can scale this card to be really, really huge, or you can just merge a white constant underneath to just fill in that black hole that's in the back there. And that's going to allow us to do a multiply. So if we do multiply, it's going to get rid of all of the white and keep the dark areas. And we see that gives us our nice shadow effect. And lastly, what you can do to make it a little bit more realistic, if you want, is I did a luminance key of the highlights of the ball we have. Did a luminance key, and I pre-multiplied that result, so we just keep the brighter areas of the sky. And I did an exponential glow and just screened that over, just to get a slight glow on the surface of this chrome ball to make it look a little bit more convincing. Again, if you were doing this for real and you want to do the full proper way of doing this, you would of course need to make sure you have your lens undistort and lens distort at the end of your ray render. So redistort. So that would be something that you want to make sure you do. And also you would put grain here as well. So you'd match your film grain to make this more convincing. But this is just a quick tutorial on how to make the reflections work there. So that's basically it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'm going to put the link in the description below if you want to download the project files. And it's a pretty straightforward tutorial. And the other thing I want to introduce you guys to is I have a website here. It's called gumroad.com/compositing academy. So if you type in this address, gumroad.com/compositing academy, I have like a little email list I'm building up that I'm going to be releasing like much larger classes on my own website and kind of off to the side. So if you guys want to keep up to date with that kind of stuff, that would be great if you're interested. So yeah, that's basically it. Thanks.